A few months ago, I was talking to a retired guy, one of those people who clearly had money. Not because of what he showed, but because of what he didn't show. No flashy car, no expensive watch, no obvious signs of wealth. If you just glanced at him, you'd think he was just a regular guy. But then, during the conversation, he casually mentioned something, almost like it slipped out. He could completely stop worrying about money and his wealth would still keep growing. And that didn't add up. Because if you've got that level of security, why not enjoy it? Why not spend more? Why not live in a more visible way? And that wasn't the only time. After that, I started noticing a pattern. Other retirees with serious wealth doing the exact same thing, living simply, quietly, almost invisible. And here's what stands out the most. It doesn't feel like a lack of money. It feels like a choice. And that raises a question most people never even think to ask. Why do people who could look rich choose not to? Because that goes against everything we've been taught. The common idea is simple. You work, you build wealth, and then you enjoy it. You show it, you signal it, but this group does the opposite. They build, and then they go quiet. And that's not random. It's not personality, and it's definitely not a coincidence. It's strategy. Today, you're going to understand exactly that. The psychology behind wealthy retirees who avoid looking wealthy. And more importantly, what they're protecting when they do it. Because once you understand this behavior, you start to notice something uncomfortable. Maybe looking rich is exactly what keeps you from staying rich. Before we even talk about behavior, you need to understand a shift that happens, almost invisibly. The shift in the goal. For most of your life, the game is just one. Grow, make more, invest more, build more wealth. Everything revolves around expansion. And in that game, showing signs of success makes sense because signaling progress reinforces your identity, keeps you motivated, and in a lot of cases, opens doors. But there's a point where that game completely changes. And that point has nothing to do with age or retirement itself. It's about structure. When your wealth reaches a level where it can support you without depending on your direct effort. At that moment, the goal stops being growth and becomes something else, preservation, and that changes everything. Because growth and preservation follow completely different rules. In growth, you can mess up, recover, adjust. In preservation, mistakes cost more, and the time to fix them is shorter. Now pay attention to this, because this is the core of all the behavior you saw earlier. When someone enters the preservation phase, they start thinking differently. Not, how can I make more? But, how do I avoid losing? And that affects everything. Investment decision, lifestyle, and most importantly, how they present themselves. Because, here's a psychological detail almost nobody notices. Exposure creates risk. And we're not just talking about investing. We're talking about behavior. The more you signal wealth, the more you attract attention, create expectation, increase social pressure, and in some cases, even real risk. And that directly conflicts with the new goal, preserve. Now connect that to the behavior you saw. These people don't look rich because they don't want to operate in an environment where they have to maintain an image. They have to sustain a standard. They have to justify their decision. They eliminate that game because that game doesn't help preserve. And this is just the beginning because this shift doesn't happen all at once. It happens in stages, and each stage reinforces that behavior even more. Stage 1, when showing wealth still makes sense. At the beginning of the journey, showing wealth isn't a mistake. In fact, in a lot of cases, it's part of the process. Think about someone still in the building phase. They're still accumulating, still relying on their own effort, still trying to grow. And at that stage, there are some invisible incentives. Showing signs of progress reinforces identity, creates a sense of moving forward, builds confidence. And in some contexts, it actually helps because signaling success can open opportunities, create connections, increase perceived value. And that's real. So in this phase, the behavior of looking successful doesn't feel wrong. It feels natural. Now watch what happens over time. As wealth grows, that same behavior starts to change its role. At first, it helps, but slowly, it starts creating something different. Expectation. And expectation comes with a cost because now you're not just living anymore. You're being watched, and that changes your decisions. You start to maintain standards you might not even need. Avoid cutting expenses, even when it would make sense. Make decisions based on how others will see them. And this still isn't a serious problem, but it's the beginning of something that becomes important later. Because that identity that helped you in the beginning can turn into a trap down the road. And most people don't notice that transition. They keep operating with the same mindset, even when the game has already changed. And that's exactly where the gap starts, because there's a second phase, a phase where maintaining that image stops helping and starts getting in the way. Stage 2, when looking rich starts to get expensive. Now we get into a point almost nobody notices while it's happening. Because on the outside, everything still looks normal. Wealth has grown. Life has improved. Options have expanded. But on the inside, the structure starts to shift. The person still keeps the same behavior patterns. More visible consumption. External signals of success. A certain level of exposure. But now it hits differently. What used to feel light starts to turn into a commitment. Because now there's a standard to maintain. And maintaining a standard takes energy, takes money, takes consistency. You're not just living anymore. You're maintaining an image, and that creates something dangerous, rigidity. Now, cutting expenses isn't simple because it's not just about money. It's about identity. Now, making more conservative decisions can feel like you're going backward. Now, living more discreetly can feel off, and that traps people because even though they have more money, they have less real freedom. Now, connect this back to the previous phase. At the beginning, looking rich helped. Here, it starts to get in the way. But this still isn't the most critical point because there's a final phase, a phase where the most strategic people do something that looks strange from the outside. They don't just reduce exposure. They actively avoid looking rich. And once you understand why, everything starts to click. Stage 3, when looking average becomes a strategy. This is where the behavior really changes. And from the outside, it looks strange because at this point, the person already has enough wealth. They could live more visibly, spend without much concern, show clear signs of wealth, but they do the opposite. They simplify, reduce exposure, avoid obvious signals, and not because they have to, but because they choose to. And that choice isn't aesthetic, it's structural. What's actually happening here? At this stage, they've realized something that completely changes the game. The biggest threat is no longer earning too little. It's losing efficiency. And looking rich creates exactly that risk. Because when you signal wealth, you step into an environment where expectations rise. Decisions become more visible. Your lifestyle tends to inflate automatically, and that creates pressure. Pressure to spend more. Pressure to maintain a level, pressure to sustain an image. And that pressure directly conflicts with the real goal. Preserve and keep the system running. So these people do something very intentional. They remove the trigger. They take out of the equation anything that attracts unnecessary attention, creates outside expectations, increases pressure to consume, and that creates an invisible advantage, the quiet advantage. Without having to maintain an image, they have more freedom to adjust their lifestyle when needed, make rational decisions, ignore outside comparisons. And it might seem small, but over the years, it becomes a massive difference. Because while other people get locked into a lifestyle, they stay flexible. And flexibility is one of the most valuable things in retirement. Now connect all of this. In phase 1, looking rich helps. In phase 2, it starts getting in the way. In phase 3, it becomes a risk that needs to be avoided. And that's exactly why you see this pattern. People with high wealth living quietly, not because they can't spend, but because they understand the hidden cost of looking like they can. And that leads straight to the closing, because now the question completely changes. So let me show you what's really behind all of this. At first, it just looked like a curious behavior. People with money who don't look like they have money. But now you can see this isn't random. It's an adaptation, a natural response to a change in the game. Because when you're building wealth, showing progress can actually help. But when you reach the point where your wealth already supports you, the game completely changes. Now it's not about growing anymore. It's about keeping the system running. And in this new game, anything that increases pressure, expectation, or rigidity starts working against you. So if someone keeps chasing visibility, they tend to raise their lifestyle, create unnecessary commitments, lose flexibility, and over time, that reduces efficiency. Now, if they choose the opposite path, less exposure, less signaling, they gain more control, more real freedom, more ability to adjust decisions, and that preserves the system. So in the end, there's no absolute right or wrong, but there are consequences. If you're still in the growth phase, looking successful might not hurt you that much. But if you've already built enough wealth and you keep operating with the same mindset, it can start getting expensive. And most people never notice this transition because on the outside, it just looks like a lifestyle choice. But on the inside, it's a preservation strategy. And maybe the most important question now is, are you still trying to look like you're growing, or have you started protecting what you've built? Because that difference, almost nobody sees it. But it's exactly what separates people who build wealth from the ones who actually keep it over time.